Good evening, everybody. The Archaeological Society Malta and the Department of Classics and Archaeology, as usual, of course, are delighted to welcome you to the second in our series of talks for 2021-22. I see that we have our international participants. Welcome to them. For those who don't know me, I'm Patricia Camilleri, President of the Archaeological Society Malta, and I shall be mediating this evening's session. I'd like to ask you all again to make sure that you mute yourselves so that we don't have echo issues. And I'd like to inform everybody that this recording is, this session is being recorded. The use of your own video, of course, is totally up to you. All these season's lectures, as last year, are a collaboration between the Department of Classics and Archaeology at the University of Malta and the Archaeological Society Malta. Thanks, as always, go to the head of the department, Dr. John Betts, and to Professor Nicholas Vella, ASM Vice President, who really helped to coordinate this, all the sessions. This evening, as usual, we'll be proceeding thus. I'll be introducing our guest speaker, Anthony Burgess, then turning the virtual floor over to him. Please do ask your questions on the chat, and anytime during the talk, you can jot them down on the chat anytime, and I shall ask Tony to answer at least some of those queries at the end of the session as time allows. This evening's lecture is entitled Flying High in an Unfriendly Sky, How Aviation Changed Malta for Good During the Second World War. So let's move on. A very quick word about our guest speaker. After gaining his bachelor's, working as a government analyst in London and 2 periods of extended travel, Mr. Burgess completed a master's in maritime archaeology with the University of Southampton in 2013, during which he studied 2 underwater aircraft crash sites here in Malta. Seeing the potential for further study of the effects of aviation on Malta, he returned here in 2014 and shortly afterwards commenced his PhD, examining how aviation affected the physical and mental landscape of Malta during the Second World War. At present, Tony is a guest lecturer in the maritime archaeology at the University of Malta. So, without further ado, Tony, over to you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you for having me for your lecture series. I love any chance I can get to talk about my PhD. So I'm very grateful for you giving me this chance to speak to your members and to those who join us today. So without further ado, I'll go straight into the lecture. So first of all, what I'm going to be covering today. So, first of all, how aviation affected the physical landscape of Malta, examining some direct examples and how they evolve over time. So I'll show what I mean by direct in the next slide. How aviation itself adapted to Malta. It wasn't a one-size-fits-all with aviation. Certain things in Malta changed the way aviation affected it as well, and how that still affects Malta to this day. So there are basically 4 broad categories I've used to classify how aviation affected Malta. The first is obvious, direct. So these are things that you look at and you know exactly what they are. You see an airfield, you know that's to do with aviation. You see an aircraft crash site, that too is aviation. But that's only part of the story. Other effects are indirect, influence, and absence. So indirect, for example, would be when you build an airfield, it needs roads, water, power, drainage. Airfields need people. These people are families. They need housing, schools, hospitals. And this causes some kind of knock-on effects, for example, impact on land prices and so on and so forth. Influenced are things that have got nothing to do with aviation per se, but somehow their design has been influenced by aviation. And a good example of this are forts, which have to adapt to new realities of what aviation means for war in order to still be relevant. And the last is one of the trickiest ones of all to pin down, and that's absence. When you build things, it often replaces other things as well. And there's other effects aviation can have due to absence as well, which you'll see as I go through this presentation. So the easy ones, the direct examples. And some of these I'll be covering in the presentation. So, obvious one here is an airfield. If you look at a Google image of Malta now, the biggest thing you'll see in Malta is the international airport. It's like a huge scale bar across the whole of the island. So in this presentation, I'll be looking at airfields because there's such a direct manifestation of aviation in Malta. Radar and acoustic stations. What you're seeing here is called the ear, the Widna, near Maktab in northern Malta. It's an acoustic mirror designed to detect sounds of approaching aircraft. It's the only one of its kind outside the UK, and there's only one built in Malta because obviously, almost as soon as I built it, radar came along and made this obsolete. Got air raid shelters, invisible on the whole, but without an air raid, without aircraft, you can't get air raids. Without air raids, you don't need a shelter. So this is a direct manifestation of aviation in Malta. And you've got things like aircraft crash sites, anti-aircraft sites, searchlight sites. All these are things you can look at and go, that's aviation. And that's what archaeology is mainly about. Is, you know, you look at a Roman villa, you know it's archaeology, it's a Roman villa, it's a manifestation. We don't think about the indirect, influenced, or absence that can sometimes go with that. So an example of influenced. This is a fort, although it doesn't look much like a fort. This is Fort Campbell, up in the northeast of Malta. Now, it doesn't look much like a fort, and that's a very deliberate policy. This was built in the 1930s. As you look at the fort, you can see, if we go to the next slide, maybe that helps a bit better. Maybe not, I'll go to the first one. So you can see that the walls are not in a regular pattern. The walls themselves are quite thin. There's no ditch. The buildings aren't necessarily military. There's not much here that looks specifically military, except maybe there are gun installations just here. And this is what it looks like from sea. Now, this was very deliberate. This was done to avoid aerial reconnaissance. They did not want Fort Campbell to be discovered. It was there to guard the northern approaches to the Grand Harbour. It was a maritime fort, focused on the sea. It's got nothing itself to do with aviation, yet its entire design has been warped by having to think about aircraft. That's what I mean about influenced. And that's why forts is such a good example for that. Moving on to absence, this is quite a famous example. This is Fort St Elmo in Valletta. This fort guards the entrance to the Grand Harbour and Martinchette. And this is from an old painting from the Knights period. There's a Knights flag there as well. And there'd been a lighthouse on the Cavalier, which is the highest point of Valletta, for centuries. And the last one they had was built in the mid-19th century, I think, by the British. And there it is on the left-hand side. That was from a diary. And we did some photographs which just come into fashion at the time. Now, the same picture taken on the right-hand side, it's obviously not there. It's completely gone. Now, you may well be thinking, what has this got to do with aviation? This is a maritime marker. Well, the answer lies, if you go to the Cavalier today, you'll see this. This is a memorial to 6 soldiers killed in the first bombing raids on Malta on the 11th of June, 1940. And that site is right by the site of the lighthouse, which would have been just there. Now, very soon after that raid, the order went out to get that lighthouse demolished. Why? It was, and I quote, believed to be an aiming mark to enemy airplanes. So once again, you've got something, nothing to do with aviation here. But because of aviation, it's been demolished. And now it's gone. So that's an example of absence. It doesn't have to be directly to do with aviation for something to happen. Sometimes you get more than one effect in one go. This is for the proposed seaplane base in the late 1930s in Marshallschlock. You can see on the map there just whereabouts it is. And on the right, you've got the plans they were going to do. It was going to be called Marshallschlock, but then they decided it was too hard for English people to pronounce, so they called it RAF St. Lucian. And it was a seaplane base. Now, you've got three manifestations here. You've got a seaplane base, which is direct, but when they built that seaplane base, they needed to take up the road along the coast, which is marked in green. That was no longer open to the public, and part of it was tarmacked over to make way for the seaplane base, which needed access to the sea. So there's absence. But on top of that, as compensation, the Air Ministry had to pay the government £700 to improve the road between M here and L, St. Lucian. Presumably the other parts of the yellow road did need improving. So they could still get access to round where the road ended, which is indirect. Now, no one driving down that road to this day is going to think about aviation, but that road was improved because of the impact of a seaplane base. This is what I mean about how aviation can affect Malta in ways we don't always see as obvious, and they still affect it to this day. Now, aviation works both ways. So aviation affected Malta, but the unique conditions of Malta itself affected the way aviation manifested itself. So this is a post-war photo of Malta, and you can see here marked in blue the different airfields it had. Some in use, some not in use. On the left-hand side, you've got Wendy, bottom left, how far. The big one in the middle is Lua and Safi, before it became one big airport. And just north of that, or northwest of that, you've got to Ali. Now you notice them, if you look at the airstrips, all of them have a similar alignment. They all align northwest to southeast. Some have got more than one airstrip. They all have at least one main airstrip in that direction. Why? Where does a prevailing wind come from in Malta? It comes from the northwest. They're aligned with the wind. So that's an example of how Malta affects the aviation that affects it. There's always unique conditions on anywhere that aviation is affecting that will change how that happens. Now these are two images of Malta taken in 1941. The one on the left in January, the one on the right in December. I'm going to highlight this area here. You can see on the left, just there where the arrow is Lua. And on the right, you've got how far. In that period, between January and December 1941, they built a trackway all the way across from Lua to how far. Built from scratch. They didn't so much as improve the roads, they built new roads entirely. Because you don't really want military traffic, military aircraft, and civilian buses, for example, sharing the same bit of road. That's not to say it didn't happen. One pilot taxiing to, I think it was how far, taxiing his Spitfire, was confronted by a bus coming the other way, taking a shortcut. Did the bus driver slow down? No. Tried to get around the Spitfire, hit the Spitfire, which then ends up with its cannon inside the bus. Cue mass panic. And that's why military aircraft and buses don't really mix. So they kept them separate with their own road networks. So you had, in effect, almost like a one airfield. You could drive an aircraft all the way from Lua up in the northwest to how far in the southeast. Now, this is from a German map taken in 1942. And this is not even when aviation was at its peak when it comes to airfields. This whole how far, Safi Lua complex. When I did a calculation, including this land, Rendi and to Ali, it amounted to 1/30th of all the land in Malta. That's a huge amount of land to dedicate to aviation, especially bearing in mind in 1942, farmland was at a premium because Malta was starving. They needed the food. But such was the priority given to aircraft, they still used the land to disperse the aircraft. And this example of it from the ground up, this is taken sometime in 1943, I think. So you see how much land it does take up for that. Now, if we look at that before and after, look at how far in Calafrone. Now, how far was the first terrestrial airfield in Malta, made in 1923? And again, talking about absence, when they built how far, it involved the destruction of over 40 miles of stone walls. So there's an example of absence right there. And you had a similar situation when you built other airfields in Lua, Safi, Rendi, and so forth. And what I've got circled there in red was the seaplane base at Calafrana, which is the first aviation base in Malta, built in 1916. Now, this is an example of how colonialism was also affecting Malta. The British didn't really need to really care what the Maltese thought about them having their walls demolished. You couldn't do that now if you had a government that is answerable to the people. This is part of the colonial relationship. They could do this. So that's another way of how the conditions of Malta affects how aviation affects it. And that's what it looks like today. Calafrana is completely gone, submerged under the freeport. How far still recognisable as an airfield, though it's not used as an airfield now, of course. I think they're going to build a racetrack there is the next grand plan for how far. But going back to the taxiways, those roads didn't disappear after the war. They're now used by cars. So again, people driving down those roads won't know they were built for aircraft, but that's why they're there. So I don't know how aviation still continues to affect Malta to this day. Looking at Lua and Safi, that's what it looked like in 1943. Now, one of the effects of buying all this land up in Malta was the effect on land prices. It wasn't the only factor. The bus service meant that more properties became more desirable in the villages. There was a construction boom, at the time as well. But the huge amount of land being bought by the government affected land prices, particularly arable land. Between 1928 and 1938, 2% of all the land in Malta Island, so not including Gozo and Camino, was brought up by the government for defensive purposes. And a large chunk of that would have been airfields. Again, that's a huge amount of land being taken up by airfields. And unfortunately, the land you need for an airfield, nice and flat, good drainage, is good arable land as well. So this had a disproportionate effect on land prices in Malta. And that, of course, affected everybody. So you've got this big knock-on effect of aviation in Malta leading up to the Second World War. And that's what Lua looks like now. If you look down the bottom right, that's all that's left of Safi, the little spur of land there. You can still see the outline of the old airfield. If I go back one, just there. And they're both being subsumed into Malta International Airfield, which is bigger than both of them combined. And again, you've got some remainders of roads now, still left from the old taxiway in the Second World War. Another example of absence. As they expanded Lua in 1942, they needed to also clear land around the airfield on the flight paths. So when they expanded the southwest northeast runway, they needed to demolish this bit of land here. This was church land. This had an old church in it. So the governor wrote to the Archbishop, who gave permission to demolish the buildings. And that was in October 1942. Look at the bottom left, January 1943, it's gone. So even though this is not even in the airfield, you've still got absence here. And that land is now, well, even today, it's a little bit controversial because that land was not meant to be built very high because it's near an airfield. And that's why the land wasn't worth very much. It got sold to a developer who got that restriction at least modified. The land became more valuable and he sold it to a major supermarket chain. So there we go. But originally that land was cleared because it was on the way of a flight path. Looking at Rendi, this is images taken in, let's have a look, at December 42, top right, bottom left, April 43, July 43, bottom right. You can see how it's developed. Even looking here, I can see how the supply situation's improved in Malta because tarmac was in short supply during the siege. But as you can see, they've used quite a lot of it on this airfield by July 1943, which shows me that the supply situation has improved. And again, this provided the infrastructure for things after the war. That's what it looks like now. Not as clear as how far, but you've got a very straight road, which was the airstrip. And not only that, but the dispersal area, the infrastructure for that has been used for development. Moving on to Ta'ali. This is Ta'ali 1943. That's what it looks like, say, very clearly an airfield, big open space. Would these structures be there now? If they hadn't cleared it for an airfield for the National Stadium, unlikely. And that's what it looks like now. Again, you've got taxiways. And when I gave showed this slide before to another group, I was informed that this road here, along the bottom, was the old railway line. I don't know if that's correct or not. So you've got a road built for railways, now connected to a road built for aircraft. So it's amazing how different influences we get in Malta. And also, all these airfields were built in areas that hadn't seen too much of the British beforehand. You know, these rural areas like How Far to Arley. The British influences have been mainly restricted more or less to the harbour area. They were seen more sophisticated there. But now you've got these latest examples of technology slap bang in the middle of the countryside. But despite that, these villages, although they were cheek by jowl with these examples of technological brilliance, even like as 1945, Lua did not have proper sewage, and Safi did not have proper drainage. So even though they're so close to the airfields, they give them their names, they still have got a little way to go to progress to match the facilities on site. And lastly, you've got an airfield up in Shakir. This was built just for the invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and was a temporary airstrip. So that's what it looks like today. Not a trick question, there's no trace of it at all. It's gone. That was very, very deliberate. The farmers in Gozo, whose permission had to ask, over 400 people, they wanted it to be temporary. They wanted their land back. And they took an appeal from the Bishop of Gozo to say, please do this, you will get your land back and you'll be compensated, for them to agree. If you look at it in 1943, it looks a bit different. There's no tarmac at all. You can't reverse tarmac so easy. This is a very, very dusty airfield. They had to bring water trucks over from Malta to keep the dust down. It's another view of it as well. And finally, looking here, looking over Rabat. And as you can see now, there is nothing left of the airfield at all. Again, though, this involved absence. That blue circle there marks where this building was, the Gorgon Tower, which was demolished to make way for the airfield. Apparently, the owners were offered, we could take it down and put it back, or we could compensate you. They took the compensation. But another example of absence of this beautiful building, which goes back, I think, 1690, it was built. Nice period. So moving on to shelters now. Invisible, but obviously still very much to do with aviation. What you're looking at here is a map of Malta showing four things. In blue, the population of the area. In brown, the amount of spaces for rock-cut shelters. One space equal 2 square feet, which isn't very much at all. Red shows the same number for privates, and then you've got concrete shelters. Now, originally the plan was to build a variety of shelters, but in January 1941, when the Germans intervened in the Maltese theatre, they brought a level of bombing, an intensity of bombing that hadn't been seen before. And the people made it very, very clear that they would settle for nothing else but rock-cut shelters. Nothing else would do. So the government focused exclusively on building shelters out of the rock. And this was as much about morale as anything else. I mean, even in Gozo, they started building air raid shelters in 41, even though Gozo was not a military target. But at the same time, I had to keep reassuring people there's a morale issue here. They've got to show the people they're on their side, they're looking after them. So that's a big reason why the big air raid shelters was to say, we're doing all we can to help you, even in places where it wasn't maybe needed, like in Gozo. There's even a file in the archives on air raid shelters on Camino, for example. Shows you how that worked. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to flick through very quickly construction of shelters from May 41 to May 42, and just keep an eye on the brown lines as I go through it. You can see there's a lot of construction in this period over 1 year, and everywhere, almost everywhere, has now got more places than people. At the start of this exercise, Valletta maybe, the three cities, they had enough, but they carried on building. Why? Because they knew 2 square feet wasn't really enough. And they thought if the bombing gets worse, people will spend longer in shelters. And that's exactly what happened. And once you start building the shelter, once you've got the entrances in, anything after that, you might as well just carry on. Because you can keep on building a shelter underground through anything. If there's an air raid, it makes no difference. And in this period, between June 41 and May 42, over 400,000 square feet of air raid shelters were excavated. And again, this is an example of how Malta has affected aviation. You could not do this in Malta. Malta was made out of granite, or it was a sand island. Because it's made of limestone, it's a perfect material to make an air raid shelter. And that's why there's over 1,000 of them in Malta. And this is a graph showing you pretty much the same thing. The big place that gained was Slima, Gaziras, and Julians. And that was an increasing population as well. Now, Valletta had quite a few open space, underground spaces already from the time of the Knights. In fact, one of them has, I think, just been open to the public, the big giant cistern and air raid shelters that go with it outside the law courts. And this example of adaptation, this is a Casa Rocca Piccola on Republic Street. And they had 4 large cisterns, or 2 massive ones, 2 slightly smaller ones. They adapted them as air raid shelters. So number 1 corresponds to number 1 photograph here. They dug down from the cellar into that first smaller cistern. And that was their own private shelter. They then took a left. Look at number 2. They then dug down again through the rock to get to the much larger cistern in number 3, which was open to the public. Comes on at 100, 200 people. Now, not everybody had access to such large shelters. This is on Rodolfo, or it was, in Salima. And this again is an adapted cistern, or what's left of it. And like all shelters, it had at least 2 entrances, stroke exits, in case one gets bombed and you can't get out. This has now been covered over by development. That's why there's no scale bar. I wasn't actually able to access the site. It's just taken from the pavement with my phone, unfortunately. But again, example of adaptation for air raid shelters. And you see them everywhere you go. Top right is from the ditch. That's a wall photo in Valletta. But if you walk in a ditch now, you can still see the blocked up entranceways. Bottom right is in Floriana. And bottom left is a attempted shelter in the 3 cities. See how they started there, and for whatever reason, they gave up. Also what was used were caves. The Hypogeum, this painting was done by Leslie Cole in 1943, but had been in use since 1940. So once again, what you're seeing here is a retreat of a pattern here. 2 things. First of all, whenever the Maltese were threatened, or anybody was threatened, you retreat within the walls. Within Valletta, Cittadella in Gozo. What was happening now was they were literally building within the walls their air raid shelters. So even though these walls were militarily redundant, they were still protecting the people in a fashion. And likewise, as throughout history in Malta, when there's a threat, people go into caves. And you saw the same thing in Malta. Ardalan was briefly occupied, got the Hypogeum, the catacombs. Various caves around Malta were occupied, including in Gozo, the shelter from the bombs. And religion played a big part in this as well. This is another painting by the same author. You see the altar there, the shelter. Now, these are various examples of religious devotion. The one on the left is from an air raid shelter you can visit in Burgess, underneath the Water at War Museum. If you've not been there, I highly recommend it. It's worth the admission price just to access the voluminous shelter underneath. That's carved directly from the rock. The one on the right is from the superintendent's, from a shelter uncovered in excavations in 2016. Extremely detailed and beautiful carving of the Christ figure there. This is not done by someone who's going to be there for a day or 2. It shows the permanence of these shelters. People knew they were not going to be there for just a few hours. They became homes. And in the absence, with the amount of bombing going on, they became forums for social activity. So much time was spent in the air raid shelters. Now, to encourage this, the British allowed the Maltese to carve niches along the corridors. This again is in Burgess, in the main shelter there. And they were encouraged to do so, to allow the use of receptacles for religious imagery. Now, as these would be lit, they also provided lighting for the shelters. Now, neither the niche excavation or the lighting were paid for by the authorities. This was done by the people. And what the British were doing, were they using, in a way, the religious feelings of the Maltese to get them to pay for their own lighting, in effect, in the shelters. So that's why they're so regularly spaced, and that's why they were done the way they were. That changed later on in the war when he used electric lights. But so next time you see these niches, know why they were encouraged to be built. It wasn't just to inspire religious devotion, it was to get the shelters lit, basically, on the cheap. Another effect of air raid shelters was what to do with the spoil. So you've got 4 images here. Top right is Cedar and Pietà as it is now. Top left is the same image taken in January 1941. Bottom left, May 1941. And bottom right, January 1942. Now, if you look at Cedar and Pietà, you see it's slowly being filled in over the course of that year. Now, why has that got anything to do with aviation? What it's got to do with aviation is what they used to fill it in with. They used the remains of bombed out buildings, and in particular, excavations, spoil from air raid shelters. They all had to go somewhere. So when you're standing, this is a more modern photo, 1944, a bit more panoramic view. When you're there, what it is now, got the marina, standing in front of Cedar Parish Church, the very ground you're on is there as a byproduct of aviation, in effect. Because without aviation, you don't need to be there. Air raid shelters, you don't get air raided, destroyed buildings as well. And this is some of the effects you still see it now. This is Guja. And if you look on the left-hand side, you can see some of the air raid shelters that were built. 1, 2, 3, and so forth, all the way down there to 14. These were built, this was done by me based on plans found at the National Archives and what was called the Public Works Department. So looked at the map on the left, found a corresponding plan on the right, and then I drew the plans from that. Now, when it comes to terrestrial wrecks in Malta, here's some examples from around the world. The one in the top left is from Russia, from deep in the forests, a German fighter plane. Bottom left is from Peat Bog in Ireland. And the one on the right is from the coast of Wales, called the Maid of Harlech, in the intertidal zone. Now, this can't happen in Malta. Why? Because Malta is a rock. There are no peat bogs. There is no intertidal zone. It's the Mediterranean. There's no vast forests for planes to get lost in and never be seen of again. Due to Malta's size, when a plane crashed, everyone could see it. And because of the sea situation, crashed aircraft were a resource to be used. See on the top right, a Beaufort being cannibalized for spare parts by the RAF. And again, this is where the geology comes in. Malta's covered in stone walls. It's a rocky island. When planes crash, they get seen, they get dismembered very quickly. There's no real remains of terrestrial aircraft on Malta when it comes to aviation. Except maybe for this. This is a photo by Anthony Rogers. This is from a Spitfire that crashed straight down into the rock at something like 400 miles an hour in the field in Sajibi. The pilot was not in the aircraft at the time, I'm happy to report. But the guns, the cannons were so embedded in the rock, they couldn't remove them. And they're still there to this day. So that's a rare example of a terrestrial crash site still being identifiable. But there were a lot of crash sites. White here is RAF, red is German, and blue is Italian. The bomb icons are for bombers, plane icons for fighters. So over the last 10 years, I've sort of been gradually building up a database. And there's about 1,176 aircraft crash sites that I found that to do with Malta. Of them, just over 600 I could plot. A lot of them, there are no real details. You just say, lost at sea, on a mission, did not return. Can't really plot that. But just over 600 I could plot. And of them, 457 are within 24 nautical miles of Malta. If you take away the ones on land, they're for 279. That is a lot of aircraft in the waters of Malta. Some of them have been found and they've been recorded. And if you're interested in this, I can highly recommend you go to this website here, underwatermalta.org, which is the underwater museum. And they got various stuff on the different aircraft they found, got 3D models you can look at, the history of the aircraft. It's a very good site, and I highly recommend you have a look at that. And it's not a permanent effect of aviation. This attracts tourists, divers come to see these now. So it's another leftover of aviation. How much time? We've got about 10 minutes. Okay, so on to anti-aircraft sites now. So what you're seeing here is how much of Malta was covered by heavy anti-aircraft sites at the beginning of the war and of the June. So the more red it is, the more guns are covering it. Now, Malta being the size it is, normally with anti-aircraft, it's done in depth. Malta being the size it is, by the time the aircraft are within anti-aircraft range, they're at their targets. So to compensate for that, they made it as dense as possible. And as I go through it, I'll do a similar sort of thing I did with the air raid shelters. You see how dense it gets. And also look how the harbour area, at first, is the most heavily defended, but then it changes. So this is in December 1940 at 15,000 feet, May 1941, November 41, May 42, October 42, July 43. So it's getting more and more concentrated, particularly around the airfields. Even Gozo now, because that's now got an airfield. It's been protected. You look at it in 3D, these are just one type of gun, which is a 3.7-inch gun. This is June 1940, December 40, May 41, November 41, May 42, October 42, July 43. Chuck in the big 4.5 guns around the harbour and 3-inch guns in Gozo, and the whole of Malta has been covered. Extremely dense. And this does leave some marks to this day. This is Fort Manuel, which had a heavy anti-aircraft site during the war. And you see, I've concentrated here on number 4 site here. It's in quite a good state of preservation. And in fact, Malta's anti-aircraft sites are actually quite well preserved compared to other ones around the world. So that's Fort Manuel. And that's what a 3.7-inch gun looks like. That's what they use. That's actually from Hajahim, which had a gun site there as well. And that photo is by Stan Fraser. This is a mobile site. And this is in Job-Lejin in the southeast of Malta. The reason it's still in one piece is because this is a protected site. You can't build on this. But it's not in use today, obviously, but you look at number 3 site there, that's now part of a road on a trackway, but it's still in pretty good condition, bearing in mind how long it's been there for. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said just down the road in Delamara. The image you're seeing on the top right is from Mario Ferrugia from Roatna, and that was taken in the early 1970s. Still in very, very, very good condition. Open site, there's no walls, accessible. Bottom right is what it looks like today. You've got a big wall around it. That red point on the bottom right is where I took a photo from, you see on the bottom left. And they're building on one of the gun sites. I don't know what the legal situation is with this. And if they're squatting on land, they bought it, I think there's a swim. You can't access this site at all, which is a real tragedy because it really was a wonderful site. But it's just lost now, unfortunately. But you've also got light anti-aircraft sites as well. This was a site for a Bofors gun. This is in St Edward's College in the 3 cities. Not accessible to the public en masse, but if you ask them nicely, not do what I did, I just turned up with the camera and said, can I take some photos? And funny enough, schools are a bit suspicious about strange men turning up with cameras. Who knew? So I had to write to them officially, ask for permission to access the site. So of course you can. And so I came in and everyone knew where it was, which was lovely. They said, I'm looking for this. Oh yeah, it's up there. Go up the steps along the walls. And there it is. It's in great nick. And this is a standard design for a Bofors site. And a Bofors gun looks something like this. So that's a Bofors light anti-aircraft gun. So I think that concludes my presentation now. I've done about 45 minutes. What I would like to say as well is all these changes to the environment affected how people live their lives. Very quickly, people became attuned to what's happening in the skies. Even people in Gozo, which wasn't really bombed, they could tell by the sound of an aircraft, even at night, if it was Allied or Axis, if it had bombs or not. When people went out to do their daily business, they would do it in mind, thinking, okay, when are the air raids going to come? Where are the air raid shelters? So you've got a situation which is so alien to us now, where We ignore what's going on in the sky. We see an aircraft, we just ignore it, and it ignores us. During the war, that wasn't the situation at all. You always had to keep one ear in the sky, looking out for aircraft, listening for the sound of bombs, for the air raid siren. So people that before the war saw aircraft almost as novelties, by the end of the war, I'm sure they were sick of them. Bear in mind how many they threw away in the cliffs of How Far. I think that's what they did. So that concludes a very quick resume of how aviation affected Malta during the Second World War. If you have any questions, and I think I do, I'll be very happy to take them now. Thank you very much.
Well done. Thank you so much, Tony. That was really, really fascinating. I think everybody's imaginations were piqued by what you were saying. There are some questions on the chat. I'll just kick off with one of my own, if you don't mind. I was thinking about the way in which the shelters were sometimes broke into actual catacomb
Yes.
sites. Clearly, very often, the shelters needed to be lower than the catacomb sites. So even at, for example, Winyakur, underneath Winyakur in Rabat, the shelter is, I think, deeper than the catacombs themselves, but they're cheek by jowl.
Yeah.
Which is rather interesting. And there are private houses, which I visited myself, where they had a catacomb in the garden. And if you visit it today, they'll tell you, oh, this is a shelter. But then when you go in, you realize that actually previously it was a single cubicle or a small catacomb, and the shelter has been sort of built within it. So I thought that was an interesting connection.
Yeah.
And now they've both become heritage sites.
Yeah, that's good.
Both the shelters and, of course, the catacombs themselves. Okay, so let's go to lots of thanks for a fantastic presentation. I'm just going to the top. Sorry. There was a road from Halfar to Kalafrana seaplane base.
There was, yes. And that was also tarmacked at the time when they expanded the airfields. I could probably go back and show you that if you look on that on that image. So yes, I mean, the reason Halfar was built where it was initially was because it was close to Kalafrana. That's why they built Halfar where it was. And then, because Halfar had more of a maritime role in the early days, Kalafrana was built to look for submarines during the First World War. And for logistic reasons, Halfar was attached to Kalafrana. So it made sense to build it nearby. But yeah, absolutely right. There was a road from Halfar to Kalafrana seaplane base.
Can you share what percentage of the undersea wrecks are surveyed?
I couldn't tell you. I couldn't give an exact figure, but I think Timmy Gamby might be a better one to ask on this one. I can think off the top of my head, surveyed maybe about a dozen, perhaps. Not a huge amount. Sometimes you survey a crash site, there's very little of it left. If it's been shot down and it hits the water in uncontrolled fashion, it just disintegrates. And then you look at the site and you may just be able to work out it's an aircraft, but what aircraft it is, you really don't know. But as a percentage, I couldn't give an exact number, I'm afraid. No. But small would be the general answer to that.
Could you tell us again how many kilometers of rubble walls were destroyed to build the airfield?
I can tell you miles. So just over 40 miles, so just over 60 kilometers. And that's, I've seen more than one estimate, but that's the lowest of the two. Over 40 miles of rubble walls for Halfar. That's just for Halfar. What it was for Lua, to Ali, Safi and the others, I don't know. But a lot.
Are there, another question, are there surviving AA examples, or were most salvage stripped post-wartime? Like,
do you mean the guns themselves? Yeah.
Yeah, I presume what's being mentioned.
There is one when I think they brought it back over from the UK. maybe a few of you know about this, but there are actually 4 intact guns, which you can find, I think it's at Lua. You saw a photo before of the 3.7-inch gun by a guy called Stan Fraser. And Stan Fraser was a gunner at Hajahim. He wrote a book called The Gunners of Hajahim. And many years after the war, he found these 4 3.7-inch guns in the UK, and he paid for them, and he got them shipped to Malta. So you've got 4 3.7-inch guns preserved. I think it's in the Armed Forces of Malta section. I think it's at Lua. So there are examples, but not actually on the sites. Yes, they would have been stripped after the war when they were no longer needed. What happened was, when Sicily was invaded in July 43 and things moved onwards, a lot of these anti-aircraft units moved with them, and obviously they took their guns with them.
That's a consideration I didn't think of. Keith is asking, what about the searchlight stations? Do these fit into the aviation picture presented?
Absolutely, and I would love to have done more work on them, but the data on searchlights wasn't as good, and it wasn't great for the other ones as well, as it was for, say, anti-aircraft and for airfields. I wasn't able to map them in the same way, for example. What I needed to do was map them and date them as well to show how it evolved. And if I couldn't do that, there wasn't really much point doing the research. So searchlights, definitely. I did mention them as one of the direct manifestations, but I wasn't able to use them in my work, unfortunately.
More questions coming up. There is an interesting network of underground hangars in Ta'ali. Do these date to World War II?
It's a very good question. I'm very glad Ryan F. brought this up. What those underground hangars are actually were underground workshops carved into the bluff at Ta'ali, but they managed to persuade the Germans they're actually underground hangars. They did that by putting wrecked aircraft near the entrances, for example, and they attacked them. The Germans attacked them thinking they were underground hangars, but they weren't. One of the reasons they thought they were underground hangars was because when the first lot of Spitfires came in, the first big lot in April 42, they were destroyed very, very quickly. Very quickly indeed. It wasn't until May 42 they worked out how to get them in and get them near quickly enough. But that first lot was destroyed very quickly. And so the Germans were wondering, where have they gone? They didn't credit themselves to destroy them so quickly. So that kind of persuaded them maybe there were underground hangars entirely after all. And also there was some prisoners of war they captured. I think some sailors said, yeah, there's some underground hangars there as well. And I know for sure, because I've seen the German archives, they were certain these were underground hangars, and they weren't. They were never used for aircraft.
That's an interesting story.
Yeah, a nice little story. Bringing that up. It's only a very little remnant. It's all gone now. But if you go to the Aviation Museum, go around the back, you can just see the entrance to one of them. But it's a very dangerous. It's all fenced off. It's a very structurally unsound area. You can't go into the hangars at all. Sorry, the workshop. Got me saying hangars now. Into the old workshops again at all. It's all fenced off. There's only one of them left on the outskirts of the Aviation Museum / National Stadium.
I'm always interested in the anti-aircraft guns that are on the top of the curtain at Fort St. Angelo.
Yes.
Which really protected the harbour in that arc sort of.
Yes.
As I've been given to understand, that they sort of had anti-aircraft guns that met in the middle and covered the harbour.
We wanted to do a crossover. I mean, you can still see some of them in the saluting battery. I think you still see some of the sites that were used for the anti-aircraft sites there. They would have been light anti-aircraft in that area, try and combat the dive bombers in particular. Because with heavy anti-aircraft, they're a bit too slow to chase the dive bombers. You want light anti-aircraft, so a bit more nimble when they're chasing those aircraft down. So there was lots of light anti-aircraft right in the harbour area. And in fact, that one for St Edward's College, that also would have contributed to defending the harbour area. Again, built into fortifications. So that provided the elevation they needed as well.
I always sort of stand there on the top of that curtain, and I think it's sort of strange to imagine that as in 1565 they were fighting the siege actually on that curtain, and again in 1942.
Yeah. Still
From the
being
same,
used.
exactly the same spot where La Valette had
Slightly
been.
different enemies, slightly different tactics, but
Yeah.
still being used.
Yeah, so
What I found most interesting about the walls being used as air raid shelters, been digging into the walls, that these old fortifications are still protecting the people in a fashion, you know, literally within the walls, which I thought was quite wonderful.
Yeah. Another question coming in. There seems to be an art of deception used to mitigate Axis attacks. What other examples do you know of in Malta, if any?
Oh, there's quite a few. There was a factory, I think, that was bombed near Jesuits Hill. And they made it seem like it was still working, but they demolished the walls around it to make it look like it'd been destroyed, for a start. We already talked about Fort Campbell, which was never detected by Axis intelligence throughout the war.
Really?
They never knew there was a fort there. Safi and Rendy were used as decoy fields before they became operational. They light them up at night, or they park old aircraft on Safi to try and draw attacks towards them. Those are some of the examples of deception they used. Also, there was more anecdotal, but they disguised some of the buildings at Canafrania to look like they'd been bombed, even though they hadn't been destroyed, to avoid them then getting bombed again. So there was deception. It wasn't quite as, thorough as, say, the UK did, which used all sorts of deception methods to try and persuade the Germans to bomb different areas, had whole areas lit up at night, trying to think that was where it's destroyed. They set things on fire to make them think they destroyed something, and got the other bombers to bomb there. And I'm not really talking about radar stations at all either. There was a whole radar war going on in Malta, but particularly in the UK, about them trying to get them off target because they were putting radar beams to get to their targets. So there was quite a lot of deception for that as well. And there's a whole book on it called Fields of Deception, written by a guy called Colin Dobinson, down in the UK. So yes, I mean, there's definitely quite a lot of deception going on when it comes to this.
Interesting. Eugene is saying the anti-aircraft guns were supposed to be located in one of the gun batteries, but they were confiscated when the War Museum was taken over in 1970s. A number of them restored to working order, mobile Bofors anti-aircraft. These were also taken by the Maltese army, have not been seen since. Do you know the story?
Yeah. That's a sad story to end the lecture. There is you can see one in the Malta War Museum. They got a Bofors gun now, I think. You can see. I don't know if they've got one in the National Museum of Fort Elmo. I don't think they have. But that doesn't massively surprise me, unfortunately.
No. Just a personal recollection. I remember interviewing or being present at an interview with somebody who was a young man in the war, in the Second World War. And he used to say how protective the British were if there was a plane that came down, because if it was left on its own, it would be sort of stripped for memorabilia, second use of parts, etc., by local people, because it was either young people who wanted, as I say, memorabilia, or other people who wanted to use bits and pieces of it. So apparently, when one of these aircraft unfortunately came down, it was always surrounded very, very quickly by British servicemen. And nobody was allowed near it, and it was always apparently a race to see who could get there
That's
first.
absolutely correct. They had to put a notice in the Times of Malta in 1940 to say, do not take things from sites, don't do it. But it was a race. People needed things. People they use the rubber to make their shoes, they'd get the metal to make combs. One lady got an entire wedding dress out of parachute silk. So it was a real struggle to get there first, and because they for military reasons, didn't want people mucking around with the sites. But you can't get there first every time. So
no,
people
absolutely
take stuff
didn't, because
and go for souvenirs. Yeah.
this gentleman proudly showed us about 3 or 4 items that he managed to retain in his collection over the years.
Well, children in particular were always collecting things. They had to collect bits of shrapnel and things like that. And then, you know, they had to be careful because later on in the war, when the Germans started dropping anti-personnel bombs, they were going for them, and obviously a lot of them were killed. But sometimes they would take things to extreme. There's one example in the diary where they go onto an airfield, these kids, and started smashing up a Spitfire because they wanted to get the perspex. So, you know, you can take it too far.
Sure.
Fortunately, they got off there before they did too much damage. Good job they did, because a bomb fell nearby quite soon after that. So they got off there just in time. But yeah, kids would do anything to get a souvenir to compete with other kids as well.
Yeah. Well, I think unless anybody else has questions to ask Dodi or put on the chat, I think we can bring this evening to a close. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating in this evening's event. We look forward to seeing you again on Wednesday, 15th December, for a lecture entitled Looking at Old Pots with Fresh Eyes, revisiting the pottery from the 1960s excavation at Ras El Raheb in Malta. It's a talk by Dr. Maxine Anastasi from the Department of Classics and Archaeology, University of Malta. I do urge you all, as always, to become members of the Archaeological Society Malta if you are not already. You can do that through the website. It's quite a simple operation. And in that way, you'll be supporting the Society in its lecture program, its peer-reviewed journal. And I can remind you that the Malta Archaeological Review, the latest issue, is now really taking shape on our website. And you'd also be helping in its advocacy work in support of all things archaeological in Malta. Sincere thanks from the Archaeological Society Malta and the Department of Classics and Archaeology, University of Malta, to Mr. Burgess for his most illuminating talk tonight. The Archaeological Society Malta looks forward to seeing you all again for our next lecture. Follow us on Facebook and on our website. Thank you so much.